She boarded a stagecoach to meet a man she'd never seen. But when the driver left her at the wrong ranch, everything changed. A crying baby, a stranger with storm-gray eyes, and one decision that would defy a lifetime of expectations. What if getting lost was the only way to be found? Stay with us. This story will change how you see love, fate, and the power of choosing your own path. The heat was merciless that day in July 1889, the kind that made the very sky seem to tremble. The Utah desert lay vast and silent, painted in hues of rust and gold, the only sound the occasional whisper of wind brushing against sunburned brush. When the Wells Fargo stagecoach creaked and groaned to a halt just east of Zion Pass, there was no grand welcome. No waiting carriage. No eager fiancé with flowers in hand. Only a gate, wooden, crooked, and weathered by time, bearing a faded sign, Walker Homestead. Inside the coach, Eleanor Hartfield sat, frozen, her gloved hands clenched tightly around the worn leather handle of her small traveling satchel. She wasn't supposed to be here, not at this place, not now. Her dress, though plain, had been chosen carefully. Her hat tilted just right. Her bundle, a wedding gown wrapped in brown paper, and string rested on her lap like a promise she no longer trusted. The dust, the heat, the silence, it all felt wrong. Desperately wrong. The driver, gruff and impatient, barely glanced over his shoulder. "End of the line for you, miss," he barked, tossing her trunk to the ground with practiced indifference. "Lancaster Place's just a stretch over the ridge. You'll find your man there." But something in Eleanor's chest tightened. This wasn't what she'd imagined. Not that she expected a fairy tale she'd left fairy tales behind in Philadelphia, along with velvet gloves, drawing rooms, and the icy judgment of her stepbrother's stares. What she wanted was freedom. A future she could shape with her own hands. What she didn't expect was to be dropped unceremoniously at the edge of a ranch that wasn't her intended destination. The moment her boots crunched the dry gravel, she knew something was off. The house in front of her wasn't the Lancaster estate described in letters. It was smaller, quieter. A log cabin flanked by 2 outbuildings and a corral stretched like open arms into the valley beyond. The mountains towered in the distance, their silhouettes painted in shades of gray and gold. The only sound was the restless snort of a horse somewhere out back, and the high-pitched cry of a baby from inside the cabin. Eleanor turned to the driver, but he was already climbing aboard, dust swirling as the coach rattled away. She stood in silence, heart thundering, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Then the front door creaked open. A man stepped onto the porch, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, suspenders framing shoulders worn by years of labor. His skin bore the sun's mark, and his jaw was dark with stubble, but it was his eyes, gray, stormy searching, that stopped Eleanor cold. In one arm he held a crying baby, wrapped in a faded quilt. "You lost?" he asked, not unkindly, but with a cautious edge that suggested he'd long since stopped expecting good things to arrive unannounced. "I think so," Eleanor replied, her voice thinner than she'd intended. "This isn't the Lancaster Ranch, no ma'am," he said, adjusting the baby gently. "That's over the ridge. You're at Walker Homestead. I was supposed to meet George Lancaster," she added quickly, as if saying the name might fix the mistake. Recognition flickered in the man's eyes. Mail order bride. Her cheeks flushed, but she lifted her chin. "Yes, we'd been corresponding." He offered a place, a new start. The man nodded slowly. "A lot of folks looking for that out here." "I should go," she said, her feet still rooted to the earth. He didn't move. "It's a long mile in this heat, and you've got no shade. Josie here was just about to have supper, and I figure you could use a drink of water, maybe catch your breath." His offer was plain practical. Not charming, not sweet, just human. And maybe it was the way he rocked the baby with one arm while holding the door open with the other. Or maybe it was how, despite his roughness, there was something solemn and kind in the way he looked at her, like he could see past the dust and discomfort and down to her fear. She followed him inside. The cabin was modest, a single room with wide planks underfoot and windows draped in fabric that looked hand-stitched. The scent of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something faintly sweet filled the air. A cradle sat near the hearth, and a rocking chair bore the gentle indentations of regular use. Everything spoke of quiet resilience. "I'm Colt Walker," he said, offering her a tin cup of water. "Eleanor Hartfield. Josie's my niece. Her mama was my sister Sarah. Fever took her last winter. And Josie's father?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "Gone. Took off the day after the funeral. Left her with me. She's all I got now." Eleanor took a sip, her throat dry with more than heat. She didn't know this man, not really. And yet, she felt safer here than she had in weeks, in months. He didn't ask about her past, but the silence between them felt like a space where stories could eventually be told. She found herself watching the way he held Josie, the careful patience in his movements. Not all strong men needed to raise their voice. She stood slowly. "I should go. George is expecting me." Colt nodded. "I'll saddle up the mule, walk you over." But as she reached for her trunk, something in her resisted. The idea of stepping into George Lancaster's house, a stranger's house, felt heavier than it had before. The air outside was still shimmering with heat, the road long and lonely. What if? She started, then stopped herself. Colt raised an eyebrow. "What if what?" She met his eyes. "What if I stayed the night?" He said nothing for a long moment, then nodded once. "Sarah's room's still made up. You'll have privacy, locks on the inside." She swallowed the gesture, almost painful. "Thank you." He didn't smile, but he didn't need to. That night, Eleanor lay in the quiet room, surrounded by someone else's memories. A quilt faded with time, a Bible with a pressed flower, a mirror so old it barely reflected. Yet, in that stillness, for the first time since her father's death, she felt something unexpected, peace. And she realized, perhaps for the first time in her life, that sometimes the road that seems wrong might lead exactly where you're meant to be. The first light of dawn filtered through muslin curtains, casting soft patterns onto the wooden floor of Sarah's room. Eleanor Hartfield awoke in unfamiliar quiet, wrapped not only in a stranger's quilt, but in the unspoken warmth of a home that did not belong to her. The ache in her shoulders reminded her of yesterday's journey, but there was a stillness in her chest, an absence of dread that felt startlingly new. She sat up slowly, taking in the simple furniture, the worn rocking chair, and the scent of lavender from a sachet tucked under her pillow. These weren't signs of wealth, but of care, of someone's life lived honestly and fully. In the main room she found Colt already at work, gently patting Josie's back while stirring a pot over the hearth with one hand. He looked up, surprised, but not startled. "You slept all right?" "Yes," she said, then hesitated. "Better than I have in a long time." He nodded, neither pressing her for more, nor brushing off her answer. It was a kind of courtesy she wasn't used to, the kind that gave her space, not silence. She accepted a tin plate of cornbread and beans, both of them eating quietly while the fire popped softly in the hearth. It was not how she imagined starting her new life, and yet she felt oddly anchored. Her glance kept drifting to the cradle by the fire, where Josie now lay, sucking her thumb content. "How did you learn to care for a baby on your own?" Eleanor asked. Colt shrugged, reaching to adjust the infant's blanket. "Didn't have a choice." Sarah passed fast, and Josie had no one else. "I've always been better with animals than people, but a baby's not so different. They just need you to show up." His words landed heavy in Eleanor's chest. Back east, people didn't say things like that. Men didn't cradle children with such tenderness, and they certainly didn't admit to being scared. Yet there he was, one man against the wilderness, quietly holding together what remained of his family, with worn hands and a heart that hadn't quit. "And the ranch?" she asked softly. He leaned back in his chair, barely staying afloat. "Winter was rough. I missed the last cattle drive to care for Sarah. Couldn't leave Josie. Some folks said I should give her up, send her to a cousin in St. Louis. But I couldn't do that. Didn't feel right." Eleanor felt the sting behind her eyes, unexpected and sharp. "You did the right thing." He met her gaze. "I'm trying. Not sure it'll be enough." A silence settled between them, not awkward, but thoughtful. Eleanor felt as though she'd wandered into the middle of someone else's story, and yet some part of her apart, buried beneath years of polite dinners and hollow conversations, was drawn to its quiet strength. She stood and began gathering the dishes instinctively. Colt didn't stop her. Instead, he watched as she moved around the small kitchen, placing things where they seemed to belong. The rhythm was natural, as though she'd been here longer than a single night. "Back in Philadelphia," she said, scrubbing a tin cup, "everything was show. A dance, a mask, a negotiation. Marrying George Lancaster was supposed to be the answer. I'd be safe, respectable, useful, but it never felt like freedom." Colt tilted his head. "And you came out here for freedom. I think I came out here to remember who I was before the world told me who I had to be." He didn't answer, just nodded slowly, like someone who understood things without needing to name them. That afternoon, they walked the perimeter of the ranch. Colt showed her the broken fence line, the patch of corn that refused to grow, the tired cow that refused to fatten. It should have been discouraging. But to Eleanor it was something real, something that could be touched, repaired, built upon. They talked about irrigation, bookkeeping, and bartering with neighbors. She made notes in her head, calculating, planning. "You know numbers?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "My father taught me. He thought I'd marry a banker. I used to manage his estate ledgers before the creditors came." Colt gave a small, surprised smile. "Well, maybe you came to the right place after all." By evening, Eleanor sat on the front porch, Josie nestled in her lap. The baby had taken to her quickly, clutching Eleanor's shawl with soft fingers as if she sensed something familiar. "She doesn't cry with you," Colt observed. Eleanor chuckled. "She's a good judge of character." The sky turned the color of old whiskey, and the crickets began their song. It was the kind of night that belonged in stories, quiet, alive, full of something that could not be named. Eleanor looked at Colt. "What do people around here say about you raising a baby alone?" He shrugged. "Some say I'm noble. Others say I'm foolish. A few just think I'm strange. And what do you think I think? Doing the right thing doesn't always look like the smart thing, but it's still right." She smiled, a soft ache blooming in her chest. "I never thought I'd admire a man I met by accident." He glanced at her. Was it an accident? She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, the sound of distant hooves shattered the peace of the evening. Colt rose slowly, squinting down the trail. "That's not a neighbor." Eleanor stood, heart suddenly pounding. A rider emerged from the dusk, then another, and a third. Colt's voice was low. "Looks like Lancaster sent a search party." The baby stirred in Eleanor's arms, sensing the shift in the air. As Colt stepped off the porch, she watched him walk toward the edge of the road, steady and tall. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew one thing with startling clarity. Whatever happened next, her story was no longer the one she thought she was living, and she wasn't walking away from it. Not now, Not ever. There is a certain kind of silence that descends just before your past catches up to you. It's not the peaceful quiet of dusk or the hush of early morning. It's heavier weighted with all the words you never said, the choices you tried to bury, and the people you never expected to see again. That silence settled over the Walker homestead as 3 riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the amber sky. Eleanor stood on the porch, heart beating in a slow, heavy rhythm, Josie curled against her chest like a secret too precious to lose. Colt didn't say a word as the riders approached. He simply stepped down from the porch, his boots stirring the red dust of the trail, shoulders squared, not with arrogance, but with the quiet resolve of a man who had been preparing for something like this his whole life. The man in the lead dismounted first, George P., Lancaster, tall, silver-haired, every inch of him pressed and polished like a man made of ambition and pride. His eyes swept the cabin, the porch, the child in Eleanor's arms, and finally Colt himself. So, this is where she's been. His voice was calm, too calm. Eleanor had expected fury. She hadn't expected calculation. Colt spoke first. She stayed the night, safe, fed. No harm done. George's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm not talking to you, rancher." He turned to Eleanor, Miss Hartfield. Or, should I say, Mrs. Walker. Now, did I miss a wedding while I was watching the ridge? Eleanor met his gaze. There's been no wedding, then we're still engaged. The air around them shifted brittle as dry grass. Eleanor felt Josie stir against her, unsettled. "I'm not going with you," she said softly. George blinked once. "Excuse me, I made a choice. Maybe not the one you were expecting. But it's mine. You and I had an arrangement. I wired funds. I opened my home. I told half the town you were coming. And now you're hiding behind a broke rancher and his bastard niece." Colt's jaw tensed, but he didn't move. Eleanor stepped forward. "Don't speak about her like that. She's more loved than you can understand." George took a step closer. "You're throwing away stability, a life of comfort." "For what? This is honest," Eleanor said, her voice rising. "This man opened his door to a stranger. He gave without asking. He protected me when he didn't have to. He didn't try to own me." George's lips curled. "Don't romanticize poverty. You think you're choosing love, you're choosing hardship. You know he's behind on payments. 3 months, one more missed note and the bank takes everything. You'll be living in a tent by winter." Eleanor turned to Colt. His face was solemn, not surprised. "Is that true?" Colt nodded once. "It is." George spread his hands. "There you have it. A man can't protect what he doesn't own. Come back with me, Eleanor. We'll forget this ever happened." Eleanor looked at Colt, then at Josie in her arms. "I'd rather sleep under the stars with a man who respects me than in silk sheets with one who doesn't." George's face darkened. "You'll regret this." Colt finally stepped between them. "That's enough." George's hand drifted to his belt, where the polished grip of a revolver gleamed faintly. "Don't," Colt said quietly. "This isn't that kind of fight." George looked at the baby again, then at Eleanor. "You'll be back. When the food runs out, when the roof leaks, when you can't buy your fancy soap or books, you'll come back." Eleanor didn't flinch. "I won't." He turned on his heel and mounted his horse. "So be it. But know this, Walker, when the bank comes knocking, I'll be the one holding the key." The 3 riders disappeared into the dusk, the sound of hooves fading into the quiet like thunder retreating across distant hills. Back on the porch, Eleanor sat down slowly, the weight of her choice settling over her like a quilt in winter. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I've made things worse for you." Colt set a hand gently on her shoulder. No, you told the truth. That never makes things worse, just harder. But your debt? I've been behind since Sarah got sick. Stayed home to care for her and Josie. Missed the cattle drive. Spent our savings on medicine that didn't work. I don't regret a cent. He sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. You still want to stay? He asked quietly. Eleanor looked at Josie, who was now asleep, one tiny fist tucked under her chin. I've never been more sure of anything. The stars began to appear above them, scattered across the velvet night like distant promises. And in that silence, Eleanor knew she had not just refused the wrong life, she had stepped fully into the right one, no matter how uncertain the road ahead might be. The morning after Lancaster rode away felt like standing at the edge of a canyon, staring into silence, waiting for the echo of your own decision to come back to you. For Eleanor, it came not with fear, but with a strange kind of stillness. A knowing. She had drawn a line in the dust, and for the first time in her life no one else had stepped across it to claim her voice. She belonged to herself now, and to this place, whatever that meant. Colt was already outside when she stepped into the soft light of morning, splitting logs near the barn, with a rhythm that spoke more of therapy than necessity. Josie sat on a quilt nearby, tugging at her toes. Eleanor watched them both for a long moment, before she rolled up her sleeves and walked into the garden with a bucket and a quiet determination. By midday, she'd repaired the chicken coop door with salvaged wire and started cataloging supplies from the pantry. She made a list, something she hadn't done since leaving Philadelphia. But unlike the to-do lists of her old life, attend this luncheon, respond to that invitation, prepare dowry accounts, this one felt like a declaration of war against chaos. A stand for a future she could build herself. Colt returned from the pasture in the early evening with dirt on his boots and a softness in his eyes. They didn't talk about George. They didn't talk about the bank. Instead, they talked about beans. How do you feel about planting a second row before September? She asked, elbow deep in a drawer of seed packets. He blinked. You think they'll take? With a little prayer and a lot of mulch, they just might. That night, as they sat on the porch, sharing a loaf of cornbread and a jar of pickled carrots, Colt said quietly, You know, when you first stepped off that coach, I figured you were gone before sundown. Eleanor looked at him, and now he glanced at Josie, sleeping nearby, then back at her. Now I can't picture this place without you. The next week brought unexpected blessings. A neighbor, old Mrs. Mildred Campbell, arrived unannounced with a suitcase and a pie, declaring, If this ranch is going to survive, it'll need more than muscle, and Moxie, it'll need supervision. She settled into the spare room and immediately set about organizing the root cellar and mending every pair of socks in sight. Eleanor welcomed the help. Having another woman in the house added a sense of balance, and Mrs. Campbell, sharp-tongued but big-hearted, kept gossip at bay in town by assuring the church ladies that everything at Walker Homestead was decent if unconventional. Word spread that Eleanor was no longer a runaway bride, but a woman with backbone willing to fight beside the man she chose. Slowly, the sideways glances in town turned to nods. Shopkeepers offered discounts. Neighbors dropped off extra feed. One even lent them a milk cow. Inside the cabin, Eleanor began teaching Colt basic ledger work in the evenings. By firelight, they'd sit at the kitchen table, her patient voice guiding his calloused fingers through rows of numbers. You've got a good mind for this, she said after a week. He chuckled, only because I've got a better teacher than I deserve. Their laughter came easier now. Their silences, too, were richer. Sometimes they'd dance. No music, just the creak of floorboards and the hum of wind through pine. Josie would watch, clapping her little hands, and Eleanor's heart would ache with something she couldn't name. One evening, after a long day of fence repair and baking bread, Colt stood in the doorway, rubbing the back of his neck. I've been thinking, he began, about doing this right. Eleanor looked up from her sewing. "What do you mean, asking you?" "Properly," she smiled. "You already did, Colt. When you opened your door to me without questions. When you let me stay, when you let me choose." He stepped closer. "Still, I'd like to ask. Will you marry me, Eleanor Hartfield? Not because you need shelter, not because the bank's breathing down our necks, but because we found something here, something worth building." She rose, heart full, eyes shimmering. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They agreed to wait until the season's harvest 3 more months to plan the wedding. Not because of tradition, but because they wanted to show the town and themselves that this wasn't a whim. It was a partnership. In those weeks, Eleanor wrote to her stepbrother not to ask for money or permission, but to say goodbye. She never received a reply, but it didn't matter. Her heart had already closed that door. Colt spent evenings carving a new cradle for Josie, one with ivy vines and stars etched along the side. Eleanor embroidered pillowcases and repaired windows. Together, they turned that cabin into more than shelter. They turned it into a home. And every night when the chores were done and the fire burned low, they sat with Josie between them, heads bowed not in fear or fatigue, but in thanks. They were still poor. The debt hadn't disappeared. Winter still loomed. But none of that could compete with the quiet joy that came from knowing they weren't facing it alone. They had sown something deeper than seeds. They had planted hope. It was a clear October morning when Eleanor stepped out onto the porch of Walker Homestead, wearing the same wedding dress she had carried across the country in a brown paper package. But this time, she was not a woman arriving with uncertainty and silence. She was stepping forward with full heart and open eyes, ready to begin a chapter she had chosen for herself. The valley had begun its slow change into autumn, and golden leaves tumbled across the yard as neighbors gathered near the pasture fence. There was no church steeple, no organ, no grand procession, only the wide sky of Zion Pass and the soft murmur of those who had come to witness something rare and powerful, a love forged not from convenience but from conviction. Colt stood beneath the old cottonwood tree with Josie in his arms, dressed in his Sunday-best clean boots, a borrowed vest, and a face full of the kind of emotion that didn't need words. Eleanor's steps were slow, steady, guided by Mrs. Mildred Campbell, who insisted on walking her down the aisle herself, claiming she'd earned the right after 6 years of telling every soul in town that the two were meant to be. The preacher was a wiry man with a voice like gravel, and a kindness that echoed in the way he looked at the couple before him. He didn't speak long, just enough to bless what was already evident to everyone gathered. This wasn't just a marriage. It was the harvest of a decision planted in grit and watered with grace. When Colt kissed Eleanor, Josie squealed with joy, and someone in the crowd, a neighbor, a stranger, no one was sure, began to clap. Then everyone did. Not the polite applause of social obligation, but the wholehearted celebration of people who knew hardship, who understood what it meant to find something worth holding onto in the wild unpredictability of life. Later that afternoon, the yard transformed into a celebration. There were pies of every kind, sweet tea-fried chicken fiddle music drifting in and out of conversations. Children ran barefoot, and old folks told stories with laughter that reached back decades. Inside the cabin, the walls echoed with new energy. Friends lingered by the hearth, commenting on the quilts, the cradle, the shelf lined with jars of preserves. Every piece of that home bore Eleanor's careful hand and Colt's quiet strength. Together they had taken what little they had and made it into more than enough. George Lancaster did not attend the wedding. Word had it he remarried a woman from Missouri, someone quiet and agreeable who never questioned his decisions. He passed Eleanor in town once, tipping his hat without a word, the light in his eyes dull and far away. But whatever power he once held over her was gone, replaced by something sturdier than revenge, peace. As winter approached, the ranch continued to stabilize. Eleanor's ledgers showed a slow but promising climb out of debt. With careful budgeting, they kept the animals fed, the roof patched, and the pantry stocked. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer frightened her. She had learned how to walk into uncertainty and plant her roots deep. Each evening, Colt and Eleanor would sit by the fire. Josie curled between them and read aloud from books borrowed from the town's tiny lending library. Sometimes it was scripture, sometimes poetry, sometimes just letters from friends. But every night ended the same, with quiet reflection, heads leaned together, hands loosely intertwined. Eleanor had once believed love came in grand declarations and perfect timing, but love, she discovered, was steadier than that. It was Colt rising early to mend fence lines before breakfast. It was Josie toddling over to bring her a wildflower. It was the comfort of knowing that even when everything felt uncertain, someone would be there beside her, holding steady. The townspeople who had once raised their brows at the idea of a mail-order bride living unmarried with a rancher now spoke with pride when they passed the homestead. "That's the Hartfield woman," they'd say. "She's the reason that place is still standing." But Eleanor never took full credit. She knew the truth. She had not saved Colt. He had not saved her. They had saved each other. On the first snowfall of December, she took Josie outside and spun in the white silence, laughing as flakes clung to their eyelashes. Colt stood on the porch, watching, his heart swelling with the knowledge that the woman dancing in the snow was the same one who had once knocked on his door by mistake. "I still don't know how you ended up here," he said when she came in. Cheeks flushed. "I followed the wrong road," she replied, setting Josie beside the fire. "And it led me exactly where I needed to be." Years later, long after Josie had grown into a young woman with her own dreams, neighbors would still speak of the couple at Walker Homestead. Of the woman who arrived a stranger and became the soul of the valley. Of the quiet cowboy who taught her that home wasn't a place, it was a person. Or, in their case, two hearts that found each other in the wilderness and decided to stay. And on long, quiet evenings, Eleanor would sometimes look across the room at Colt, his gray at the temples, and laugh lines deepened by time, and she would think of that day at the gate, the dust, the heat, the fear, and she would smile, knowing that the wrong address had given her the right life. Because sometimes the best things in life come when we stop searching for what's expected and start welcoming what's true. Because love doesn't arrive on schedule. It doesn't come with guarantees or safe bets. It comes like a knock on the door you weren't expecting. And when you answer it, everything changes. That was the story of Eleanor and Colt. Not the kind you find in dime novels or whispered over parlor tea, but the kind that grows deep and quiet, like tree roots winding through rock. A story about choosing to stay, and learning that staying when the world says run is the bravest kind of love there is. It was a clear October morning when Eleanor stepped out onto the porch of Walker Homestead, wearing the same wedding dress she had carried across the country in a brown paper package. But this time, she was not a woman arriving with uncertainty and silence. She was stepping forward with full heart and open eyes, ready to begin a chapter she had chosen for herself. The valley had begun its slow change into autumn, and golden leaves tumbled across the yard as neighbors gathered near the pasture fence. There was no church steeple, no organ, no grand procession, only the wide sky of Zion Pass and the soft murmur of those who had come to witness something rare and powerful, a love forged not from convenience, but from conviction. Colt stood beneath the old cottonwood tree with Josie in his arms, dressed in his Sunday-best clean boots, a borrowed vest, and a face full of the kind of emotion that didn't need words. Eleanor's steps were slow, steady, guided by Mrs. Mildred Campbell, who insisted on walking her down the aisle herself, claiming she'd earned the right after 6 years of telling every soul in town that the two were meant to be. The preacher was a wiry man with a voice like gravel, and a kindness that echoed in the way he looked at the couple before him. He didn't speak long, just enough to bless what was already evident to everyone gathered. This wasn't just a marriage, it was the harvest of a decision planted in grit and watered with grace. When Colt kissed Eleanor, Josie squealed with joy, and someone in the crowd began to clap. Then everyone did. Not the polite applause of social obligation, but the wholehearted celebration of people who knew hardship, who understood what it meant to find something worth holding on to in the wild unpredictability of life. Later that afternoon, the yard transformed into a celebration. There were pies of every kind, sweet tea fiddle music, children running barefoot. Inside the cabin, the walls echoed with new energy. Every piece of that home bore Eleanor's careful hand and Colt's quiet strength. Together, they had taken what little they had and made it into more than enough. George Lancaster did not attend the wedding. He passed Eleanor in town once, tipping his hat without a word, the light in his eyes dull and far away. But whatever power he once held over her was gone, replaced by something sturdier than revenge, peace. Winter came, and with it a deeper rhythm of life. Eleanor's ledgers showed a slow but promising climb out of debt. Each evening, Colt and Eleanor would sit by the fire, Josie curled between them, reading aloud from books borrowed from the town's tiny library. Sometimes it was scripture, sometimes poetry, but every night ended the same with quiet reflection, heads leaned together, hands loosely intertwined. Eleanor had once believed love came in grand declarations, but love, she discovered, was steadier. It was Colt rising early to mend fence lines before breakfast. It was Josie toddling over to bring her a wildflower. It was the comfort of knowing that even when everything felt uncertain, someone would be there beside her, holding steady. They didn't save each other in one grand act, they did it in 100 quiet ways. With respect, with presence, with a promise renewed each day. And so, what can we take from this story? Perhaps it's this, that the most important journeys in life are often the ones we never plan. That courage doesn't always roar, it often whispers through choices made with heart. And that real love, isn't about wealth or timing, but about choosing someone over and over, especially when it's hard. So, wherever you are in your life, whether you're standing at the edge of a decision or simply trying to find your way back to yourself, remember this story. Eleanor didn't wait for a perfect beginning. She followed a road she didn't mean to take and found the life she didn't know she was meant for. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of something true, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep telling stories that matter, stories of hope, grit, and the quiet strength of choosing love. Until next time, remember, sometimes the wrong door leads you exactly where you belong.